Welcome to Astro AWANI LINC's brand new webinar platform designed to enhance your experience. A couple of hygiene points. We recommend that you shut down other video and audio tabs to clear up your bandwidth for a better experience. Should you experience any technical difficulties such as lag or interruptions, please click on the red reconnect button. If there is a major glitch that is experienced by a majority of the people in the room, we may reset the entire system. Just sit back and relax. You will be taken to a new room automatically. If you have a question you would like to ask the speakers, kindly mark your remark as a question. And finally, we would appreciate it if you could tell us what you think of your webinar experience. Do give us a 5-star rating if you like the session and write to us via the contact us form on our website.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for tuning in, joining us this morning or evening, depending on where you are in the world, for this very, very exciting and interesting webinar hosted by Astro AWANI LINC, titled Equal Access: Do Refugee Children Deserve to be Educated Like Everyone Else? And yes, it is the year 2020, and yes, we are still asking this question because millions of children are still left out of an education. So this pandemic has rewritten the rules of education. Overnight, schools and education institutions have had to change how they teach and rethink what resources are critical to get the job done. Equitable access to education for many marginalised children in Malaysia is nothing new. It's been an uphill battle for many years, with many people and different stakeholders working on tackling this challenge. However, over the past 8 months, this pandemic and the restrictions that have followed it have uncovered massive gaps and spotlighted the many inequalities, especially within the refugee, stateless children, and some Malaysian communities. So to begin with, we know that access and admission to schools is extremely limited, as well as further education and employment opportunities as the children get older. So what we have witnessed and experienced this year confirms to me that when we leave people behind, we all lose. What more are children, the inheritors and hope of this world? Without an education, we are not setting them up for success. And in turn, won't we all suffer? As we rethink education in this post-COVID world, well, almost post-COVID, we ask, what will change? And also, who will benefit and who will get left behind? And can we use this opportunity to work towards a more inclusive education system? So today, I'm joined by 3 individuals with their unique personal stories, all involved in education, but addressing the issue at different levels, all working towards a common goal, a more inclusive world for all our children and youth. So if they'd like to switch their cameras on and join me. We have Dr. Elizabeth Lee. Yes, hi. And she is the CEO of Huawei Education Group, a highly respected leader who has developed a dynamic league of educational institutions here, but has also paved the way for a more holistic, sustainable solutions approach within our country. We have Nick Sabato joining us from Arizona. He's the Director of Education for Humanity at the Arizona State University, a global leader in delivering higher education opportunities for displaced people globally through tech-enabled solutions. And we have Sabri Hassan, who's from Yemen, currently living in Malaysia as a refugee, a Fuji School alumni, so I know him very well. And he's grown into such an impressive, intelligent, compassionate young man. He's part of the refugee youth-led Project Stand-Up team, a community leader, and he's currently waiting to get into university to study political science. We also had another panelist, Chegu Samuel. Unfortunately, he's unable to be with us today due to a personal emergency. He's a teacher and top finalist at the Global Teacher Prize 2020. So for those of you who read in the papers, he was in the top 10 out of thousands of teachers around the world doing amazing things, bringing equitable access to education for our Orang Asli community here in Malaysia. And he actually, the winner was actually selected from India, but was very generous to share part of his winnings with the top finalists. So he's been given, I think, about $50,000 US, and we're very excited to see how he's going to use that money for good. And a little bit about myself. My name's Deborah, and the reason I guess I'm here moderating, apart from the fact that I do it professionally, is because I've run a nonprofit for about 10 years now, working with the refugee population in Malaysia, in terms of access to education, also in terms of building the entrepreneurial spirit and self-reliance amongst communities. And we also run a social enterprise as well. So I'm really happy to be here together with our panelists. So I'd like to jump straight in, starting with you, Sabri, the youngest of our panelists. The question I always ask, and this is going back many years when I first started doing this work, was, wouldn't it be nice if all children could go to school? A very simple question. And one of our PG school students shared on their Instagram yesterday, saying that this is a really important topic that many people don't know about. And like I said earlier, it's 2020, we're still talking about equal access. The fact that all children, no matter who they are, where they come from, have the right to be in school. So Sabri, tell us your story, particularly the challenges and opportunities you face in accessing education.
Thank you very much for all of you having me here with you. So I came to Malaysia in 2013, and I was holding a grade 9 school certificate. And likely back in Yemen, I never missed a year of my education. But coming to Malaysia was due to the conflict that was going back in my country. And when I came to Malaysia, I thought it's normal that I'll be continuing my education, despite that, I am a refugee. But things become the opposite, right? As a refugee, I was not able to access, formal education. I missed quite a lot of years. I graduated from grade 9 at the end of 2012. Until now, it was very challenging to get to high school, right? So things seem to be the opposite, right? So I had to take an alternative way. I became, I wanted to volunteer in community service, work with the NGOs, do internship, all of this as a pathway so that I can actually have at least a chance to succeed in the future or access higher education. Otherwise, it will just be very difficult for you to access to any education opportunities. And one of the opportunities that, this is the challenge. The opportunities is that I was able to actually work with, let's say, refugee NGOs that, collaborate with refugees. For example, refugee organizations. I did a lot of internship there. I was one of the co-founders of Project Stand Up. So these are all a pathway to actually build up my CV, to at least have a chance to towards my education.
And Dr. Elizabeth, the Sunway Education Group is an education leader not only in its world-class education institutions, but importantly, the role it plays as a strong private sector voice that champions specific sustainable development goals and causes. And if we are serious about addressing certain SDGs and poverty, child marriage, and a range of other social issues, isn't education the game changer? And so what's your game plan?
We totally believe that education is the single foremost game changer when it comes to lifting people out of poverty, lifting people out of disadvantaged situations, and paving a better way forward. I was very touched listening to Sabri because he was relating a real life experience, which any of us could be in. As I always say, we're just very lucky that we're in this country where there is relative peace and we don't need to flee our nation like Sabri and many others out there have had to do. So we could have landed ourselves in such a situation if there was unrest or anything that is unfortunate that could happen to our nation, which has caused us to do that. So as such, we should really try to help, well, in this case, refugees who come to us. But unfortunately right now, and we have been exploring this, the laws don't seem to allow for that to easily happen. Not yet anyway. We're still trying very hard. The Sunway Education Group is owned and governed by the Jeffrey Chia Foundation, where we truly believe that we need to provide inclusive education. And if you look at the Malaysian education blueprint, it states very clearly that no child should be denied access to education regardless of whatever backgrounds, etc. So in clinging on to that, let's see how we can move ahead, lobby the right channels, and hopefully open doors to refugees for higher education.
And Dr. Elizabeth, what are some of the main focuses now that the Sunway Education Group is working on? And not just specific, but in general.
Well, we offer a lot of scholarships because we understand that sometimes it's very difficult. I mean, financial constraints will always be there, especially for the marginalized communities. And so one of the biggest things that we do is in terms of giving out scholarships to those who are deserving. And this I have to thank my chairman, Tan Sri Jeffrey Chia, for having the foresight and the vision and also the heart to want to give back and to contribute, not just to the nation, but also to the region and now the world, so as to say. And the thing is that through education, he has placed the whole Sunway Education Group into a foundation. And the idea is to try to see how we can support education in ways of, well, providing education to those who are deserving. And also, not to forget, another important pillar would be research and how to support research, because the other thing that we believe in is that, you know, if there's no research, there's really no future. As plain as that.
Okay, thank you. And Nick, as Sabri was saying earlier, talking about the fact that he missed out on years and chunks of his school, we know that education for refugees is often fraught with basically disrupted periods and gaps. And when they do have the learning opportunities, eventually they struggle to be successful. So the system doesn't cater for them because they don't have certificates, and due to their non-linear journey, they just can't seem to fit in. So I like what you're doing at ASU, and when you're doing it about, you talk about meeting them where they are and recognize the struggles that they face and that are preventing them from getting ahead. And you offer very suitable solutions. So can you tell us a bit more about Education for Humanity, how it came about, and what success looks like, I guess, for you?
Sure. Well, thank you so much for the question, and thank you so much for having me on what remains a critical conversation and will remain so for some time. The Education for Humanity initiative started at Arizona State University about 3.5 years ago, really based on a mandate from the university president, Michael Crow. So Arizona State University is one of the largest public institutions in the United States, and really over the last 2 decades has made it a priority to seek different ways to be more inclusive of learners, regardless of their background, regardless of their credentials, regardless of other constraining variables, but seeks ways to offer pathways to learners who are motivated and dedicated to being able to access higher education. And so this began domestically and then kind of grew into more of a global venture. And so Education for Humanity is kind of a further extension of that, with a mission to extend educational access to refugees and communities that are affected by displacement worldwide. So we work hand in hand with local governments, with large-scale international non-governmental organizations, with local grassroots organizations and with refugees themselves to identify the most appropriate offerings for a specific context. So in some cases, it may be preparatory offerings that are focused on English language learning, or in some cases, it may be actual degree pathways for individuals. But overarchingly, the premise of our initiative is to offer online education that is blended in nature, so facilitated locally by partner organizations to really try to provide a rich experience for learners that's technology supported. And so we're just excited to kind of continue to see how best we can align with learner ambitions so that individuals are able to continue their learning journey, perhaps not as constrained by the traditional barriers that are currently in place.
I have to agree with you, Nick, because it is a global challenge, right? And we're seeing the need all over the world, and it's not going away anytime soon. So there needs to be a global response, and it cannot just be sitting in a classroom. It has to be online learning. But I have to give it to you, it is a very bold and daring ambition, but you need to think big, right? If you're gonna bring education to the displaced community all over the world.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think it's conversations like this that kind of start to illuminate what creative partnerships might be able to develop. Because I think not one of us is going to be able to solve this by no one institution, but really thinking creatively and cross-sectorally, I think is critical in really helping define pathways that learners can reliably go down, whether they live in an environment in which they're not constrained by policies, or if they're in a host country that does have some policies that are more challenging for learners to progress. So again, thanks for convening this group.
And it's just off your point, I see that you're doing these amazing things, and you're breaking barriers, you're pushing forward despite the challenges, and you're also working, as you say, cross-sectorally, but also with different cultures, communities, governments, perhaps, and so you're dealing with very different mindsets. Something I'd like to address, especially something I've seen in Malaysia, is this idea that there isn't enough for all mentality. So if a refugee kid gets to go to school, he or she is taking the place of somebody else. And so there is less for them. This very us versus the other type thing. So essentially, for him to gain, I need to lose. And a lot of people also think this requires, for the marginalized community anyway, it's too difficult. They require too many resources. There's not enough for the rest. And is it really worth it? So is there enough for all? Or are resources finite and limited, and we've just got to leave some people behind, which a lot of people genuinely think. Until I've been satisfied, there is no room for you in this room. So Sabri, with your journey in mind, why should refugee kids be given access to education? How can your contribution to society make it worthwhile for marginalized communities to get an education?
Well, I think logically, when refugees get access to education, that means they're working on their future, right? And there will be less poverty in the area that they live, for example. And also, one of the things that why refugees should be actually accessing education is that without education, they will just be left alone. Like, they can't be self-reliant, they cannot be self-independent. They will always rely on humanitarian organizations for aid and for support. But if they equip themselves academically, they can get a better job, they can, sustain their future. So I think that's why it's very important for refugees to access to education.
And Sabri, from you live in your community, you see day-to-day examples of refugees giving back and living amongst the Malaysian society. Can you share with us any stories of people working, integrating? Right.
So I think I'll just talk about the community that I live in now. Most of them, youth that same, as my age, girls and boys, they have similar problems as I have academically. Like, for example, they ended up their education in grade 9 or maybe at grade 7. So they're stuck just as I am. And the other thing is that they cannot, let's say, access to formal schools. Like, let's say we have a government school that is, let's say, 5 kilometers away. They cannot access it, but they see students that they wish, right? They have the ambitions to go to study, but they can't. It's like you see something in front of you, but you don't have the right, but you cannot enjoy the fundamental rights that you should be enjoying. So that's the story that I always wanted to share on what is happening in my community.
Okay. And Dr. Elizabeth, there's this phrase I really like to use. We say university isn't for everyone, but the choice to study should be. And so I think your Sunway Education Group really goes beyond traditional CSR, really thinking out of the box in creating access and opportunity. And there is a growing number of refugee youth here that are desperate to study beyond sort of the traditional, I guess, degree pathway.
Yep.
What other possibilities could there be to at least start the process, given the fact of the legal restrictions which are in place?
Yep, we have been thinking of that, very much so. Let's not go into the legalities because it's so complicated. But it doesn't stop us from offering refugee children, for example, short courses that are skill-based. And what I do like within the system is that now micro-credentials have been enabled. And so I see that as a possible route whereby the marginalized and in this particular case, the refugee children or young people are able to access and learn some of these skill-based courses, which can eventually, via the different other provisions within the education framework, work towards, when the time is right, a formal degree, for example. So I can see sort of a pathway, and I'm quite excited about it. So my colleagues and I are actually exploring that pathway without breaking any laws, and at the same time be able to instill some skills and some learning, which is so important for our guests right now. If they're, well, they, in a way, our refugees are our guests, and to enable them wherever they settle into eventually, that they can be immediately be able to serve the community with their skills and with their knowledge and with their education. So we can see, and as I was discussing this with my colleagues, I said, hey, you know, I think there are pathways down there in that jungle, but it's up to us to see how we can really create a proper road. So let's just go in there and see how to chart the way. And I know for a fact that while there are concerns that you have pointed out, Deborah, but on the other hand, you know, this leads me back to that starfish story. Do you know that one? Where they said, you know, that there's this little boy is walking on the beach and he picks up a starfish and he throws it back into the ocean. And then the mother says, why do you do that? You know, there are hundreds of starfishes around and you can't save them all. And he says, well, I saved that one. So the thing is that we have to start somewhere, whether it's one person, whether it's 5 people, and not just say, oh, we have all these other people to look at. The problem is too big. Let's think of our own citizens first. But to start, make a start somewhere, and hopefully that's when bigger changes can come.
And I have to say, obviously, because of the work I do with Fuji School, we've done a lot of collaborations and partnerships with the Sunway Education Group, various universities and such. And what I love about it is that young Malaysians are getting their hands dirty,
Yes.
so to speak. It's not just reading about it in the media. It's not learning about it in your 30s and 40s, but as
Absolutely.
part of their education, as a core part of their education. It's the volunteerism spirit. It's reaching out to and learning about something completely different and perhaps alien. And I think that's where the change perhaps begins.
Absolutely. We have to change ourselves. It has to begin with each one of us. You know, we give so much lip service to inclusivity and talking about, you know, inclusive education and all that, but we have to live it. We have to demonstrate it. It has to come from each one of us. And we can't just talk about it.
Absolutely. Thank you. Nick, you work with such a diverse range of global stakeholders. How do you navigate murky waters, especially in different localized settings? Is it a question of human rights? Is it a question of refugees' ability to contribute back to the economy, education, equals empowerment, and self-reliance? What do your conversations look like?
Well, indeed murky many times, but I think all of the components that you just touched on are all extremely relevant. Each different community or context is kind of its own ecosystem. And so prior to our developing an offering or implementing a program in a certain context, it would be irresponsible of us to not understand that ecosystem as well as possible. So that includes working with a number of those different stakeholders that I mentioned, from the government perspective, from NGO perspective, from the community members themselves. Whenever we implement a program, it's common practice to ensure that there's a diversity of students within the program itself. So. And diverse on a number of factors. So, of course, gender, but also being able to ensure that there are seats or spots for local community members to be involved in, so that the program is not itself a refugee-specific program, but kind of an inclusive program for the communities in which the refugees reside. So the idea being that refugee learners will very likely be able to contribute extremely effectively within the own community in which they reside. And so how best do we serve as an integrative model that help those individuals to not only understand the context in which they're living, but create relationships with those around them that will then kind of break down some of those stereotypes that may exist. Just to comment on your comment earlier regarding kind of what would be considered a zero-sum game if we give it to refugees, its resources taken from others. I think any of us would be challenged to find a time when we were exposed to other individuals from other places with different backgrounds, that we didn't become a bit more enriched ourselves. And so I think that this certainly plays to that as well, that it's an enriching experience to have some more of that integration between learners and communities and backgrounds as part of an educational program in particular.
Yeah, and if I could just continue on the point of integration, because I think that is so important. The problem I see also in so many countries is that because communities live so separately, and the help is so refugee specific or stateless specific, that you don't see that interaction. And so you're not going to overcome the myths and the misconceptions and the discrimination, and you're not going to bridge pathways. So from your experience, is this a great model for integration? And you see many success stories?
I think it's a part of a larger model. So I don't think it's the end all be all, but I think, certainly partnered with other beneficial factors that may be taken by other partners or by other entities within a community. I think that this can serve as a model for others to espouse as well, where simply kind of bringing individuals together who are part of the same community is kind of a quick way to and have them begin working toward a common goal starts to shed some of those stereotypes and enable individuals to see some of the similarities within each other rather than differences.
Yeah, and we always say we fear what we don't know or don't understand. So sometimes the refugee, especially in Malaysia, looks very scary, dangerous, here to take from us. And until you meet someone like Sabri, and then you realize, oh, wow, he's just like me. And it's really that simple. So Sabri, what misconceptions about refugee youth in Malaysia would you like to address? What have you experienced? Can you unmute?
Yep. So the misconception that I would like to address is that, refugees actually will not take, I think maybe locals have the idea of that refugees will take, an advantage from the employment perspective, from opportunities, and then the opportunities for the locals will be limited. Well, it's actually the opposite. If we look maybe to, look at Canada, for example, right? I know Canada is a very big country, and they're economically, stable, and they're somehow stronger than Malaysia in terms of, talking about economic and all of that. But still, in Malaysia, refugees will still contribute back to the economy. That's, maybe by increasing the rate of employment, filling up the professional sectors, health, science, and all of that. But maybe the locals have a misconception about that, and that refugees will not only contribute to the economy, but they will actually take the chances from the locals, which is totally, I think, I believe, this is my personal opinion, that is actually wrong. Or maybe we need to review that a little bit from, out of the box, than actually just saying it, but looking at it at a global scale.
Okay, thank you. And now quickly jumping onto the role of technology in education, especially with this pandemic, it's highlighted, like we said earlier, so many big gaps. And with refugees and displaced people all over the world, also marginalized communities in Malaysia, how do people cope and how do they overcome barriers to education? So this pandemic has flung us very quickly onto the tech train, faster than many of us ever imagined. But for some, you have 5 laptops at home. You attend schools which are agile and able to support transition from in-class to e-class. So online learning is pretty smooth sailing for these families. But what about the remote areas? What about urban poor? What about refugees or stateless families who are pretty much isolated from the most of society? They don't have access to the right gadgets, and connectivity is very, very poor. And we've seen obviously so many stories in the papers here in Malaysia and perhaps all across the world. So can tech be harnessed for the good of all? I know, Nick, you were just telling us a little bit about how you're trying to solve this massive issue using e-learning. So maybe tell us a little bit more how that actually is being rolled out. And do you need an e-learning culture existing in those communities in order for it to be easier? And is it a one-size-fits-all solution?
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question, and one that I think could entertain the conversation for hours to come. I think it's an issue that it's a dangerous issue in that it could kind of further the digital divide, so to speak, if not taken carefully. So as you mentioned, this may not be a large jump for some communities, but for others it's enormous and frankly impossible to the degree in which it would be possible in some more affluent communities. The way in which ASU has approached this is, again, kind of looking to understand each community as best as we can, and understand the restrictions that may come with internet connectivity or data, or also experience in accessing some of these courses. For example, in kind of our early first months of implementing programs, primarily in the Middle East, we recognized that there was a very significant stigma against online learning. And so realized that we first needed to address that. What is the difference between face-to-face traditional classroom-based learning and that of an online learning environment. So we developed a series of modules that kind of introduced the learner to online learning and provided some of those comparisons about how learners can succeed in an online learning environment. The other component to our approach is connectivity is a spectrum. So being able to understand that we need to create offerings that may be more appropriate in low connectivity environments or no connectivity environments, seeking offline resources, just to make sure that we're able to provide something for learners along the spectrum of connectivity.
Okay, and Sabri, for you, how has technology helped you, changed your life?
Right. So are we talking about just technology in general, or something that we use it to contribute back to our community?
And for you, pursuing your further education?
Right. So, as a refugee joining different projects, doing internship with different NGOs, for example, what actually enabled me is that I contribute back to my community, for example, by helping them to draft a formal letter. For example, in the past, what I've been doing is actually volunteering with my community center, which is, whenever there is a formal report to make, I know how to use the computer. I know how to actually draft a formal document. I know how to use the small tools that, are, something that not everyone knows, but you know it because you have volunteered with different people, different professionals, and that you gain the experience. So I use technology as a tool to support my community in terms of looking at the data, how many cases, for example, how many people received food during the pandemic, how many families are still affected, the numbers of families, disabilities, kind of also, all this type of skills like analyzing and all of that. It was very important actually. And that's, why it's important to what I actually contribute back to my community using technology.
Thank you, Sabri. And Dr. Elizabeth, what opportunities are available to marginalized children in Malaysia across your institutions, and the role of technology in making education more accessible?
Let me address the technology first. I mean, we have all been thrown into advances in using technology to support teaching and learning this year because of the pandemic. We have been forced actually into it, whether we liked it or not, which isn't exactly a bad thing, because we have always known that this will be a way of the future. But what the pandemic has also shown us is that we do have those pockets, and we end up marginalizing people even more because of the inability to access the connectivity, for example. We've heard stories of how students have to climb trees to get hold of some internet signals, etc. So what we've done on campus now is that even though universities remain closed and we are mandated to close, nevertheless, I have made it quite clear to my ministry that in order to support our students' learning and online learning, we have to nevertheless allow them to be able to access the campus to make use of the internet connection, for example. We are so well wired here. We have a campus full of internet, and yet it's not being used. I mean, I think that's a great sin. And so we do have students who come back because they are having problems with their connectivity wherever they are. So these students could be students who live around here, or they actually could be international students have chosen not to go home for a host of reasons, and to study online from Malaysia, or they could be outstation students because of connectivity, etc. So we have opened up so that our students can have access to our resources and our facilities, basically what we need to do in order to support their learning, even though it's online. So that is one of the things with technology. I also, as I was listening to both Nick and Sabri, I remember when you will remember the great Nepal earthquake, and we were all thinking, what can we do to help Nepal, because it was so devastating, and people were sending water, etc. We actually took the unprecedented step of providing education. We said, give us 5 young people whose families are very much affected by the earthquake. And we did this hand in hand with the Nepalese government, of course, and with Mercy Malaysia, who was on hand with medical aid in Nepal. And so when the 5 students were chosen and they came to us, the proviso was that eventually when they finished their higher education, they must go back to their countries, to their country, or rather, to see how they can help rebuild Nepal. But one of the things, the first thing we did was to equip them with a laptop each. I still remember the look in their eyes when they received, they came, we welcomed them, and the laptops was a gift from the wife of our founder and chairman, Tan Sri Jeffrey Chia. It's Tan Sri Susan herself. And so we bought these laptops and we gave them to the 5 students. And you should have seen them, they were tearing up and they were gasping. But that was realizing the importance of technology in today's environment. And this was already so many years ago. And I still remember when they graduated and went back earlier this year and at the end of last year. They carried the laptop that they've had with them for the last 4 years back with them. So this is the way we see the importance of technology in enabling education in this day and age. So that is addressing the technology. I'm sorry, Deborah, you asked me another question, did you?
Just saying the role in making education more accessible and how you use technology to do that.
Oh, so I think I've answered.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly, in that sense. But we have a question from Amira. She sent this question in. She's from Unimas. I'd like to ask, can online learning help refugees access education, especially in remote areas? If yes, under what conditions? Because certain areas might have issues on internet access. How to incentivize governments, universities, and tech companies to expand online learning opportunities. She said for refugees, but essentially it can be for Orang Asli communities, stateless children. Dr. Elizabeth, if you'd like to take that question.
I think there's a lot of reliance on the government most of the time to wire up the whole country, and it is a huge country and we have many remote areas, and I believe that they're doing the best that they can, especially during this time when it is so evident that we need that connection. But having said that, I suppose not just ourselves, any one of us could see how we can help, maybe by inviting these students who need access in some way to come out into the areas which has better connectivity, for example, or we enable by offering them, corporations can get involved, industry can get involved. It's not just the government. Like you well said just now, Deborah, there are some of us who may have 5 laptops at home. Do we really need 5 laptops? Can we just survive on 1 and give the other 4 away, for example? So I'm trying to say that each one of us can do a lot more. And the more we do, the more we appreciate and understand what's going on out there and how we can help more. As I go back to my premise much earlier on, it really starts with the self. It really starts with all of us. It's not a problem for someone else.
Okay, thank you. No, and I fully agree. It really starts with our individual. It's changing, not looking at a big picture and how to change your nation, but sometimes it's changing the community first, the people that you live with, and that can expand outwards. But Nick, as you know, the landscape in Malaysia is a little bit gray at times in terms of access to formal education, as we've been speaking about. So because of that, how, in your opinion, in terms of access education for stateless children, for refugees, and also local Malaysian kids who are in very remote areas, how would you see e-learning as that potential solution? Because it connects them to not just resources within Malaysia, but the world, and perhaps even opportunities at employment, right? Because we talk about not just education, but what comes next. Can you tap into that global employment market? And we see so many people working. All you need is a laptop, a stable connection, and you can work anywhere in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it kind of harkens back to a comment you made earlier, Deborah, about kind of a degree being an option for everyone, or university being an option for everyone, but not necessarily perhaps the desire of everyone. And so I think education and e-learning, online learning in particular, can really serve as a beneficial means in a number of ways. One of which being just the experience of engaging in an online education environment. And again, this could be very low bandwidth, mobile first access to an educational platform. There's inherently communication strategies, both between yourself and a teacher or a faculty member, but as well as your peers that you're interacting with in a digital manner. But that can build some skills, some digital skills that do provide benefit for someone in the workplace. And I think, you know, for in terms of being able to be creative about partnerships or ways to support individuals, particularly in remote areas. One of the comments regarding the corporations becoming involved, I think, is certainly one that holds a lot of merit. Very often, these communities may be ones that could supply employment for large-scale corporations someday. And so, you know, there's certainly a number of innovative projects that have involved corporations and nonprofits before that have built this kind of a pipeline of employment opportunities that's been to the benefit of all. And also, I think the provision and utilization of relationships with foundations or governments or whomever that may be able to provide some what are really relatively small data bundles. We've seen in some refugee communities where bundles are provided that enable learners to access content, perhaps in remote areas where they would otherwise be unable. And so learners are creative and resilient and are often the best ones to decide exactly which pathways they're able to go down. And so it really comes down to listening and then trying to creatively leverage relationships to provide that support.
Okay. Well, we asked the poll, we sent out a poll to our viewers earlier, and the first one was, should refugees have the right to education? You'll be happy to know that everyone said yes, 100%. So based on that, we could solve all the world's problems. And the second poll we asked them was, online learning, are we ready for it? So this is interesting because it's about 50-50. A lot of people still feel not quite equipped. And I think perhaps that's coming out of this pandemic. And if you hear stories of families, all families on any end of the spectrum, how tough it's been for families to just do everything fully online. It has been quite challenging. But if I'd like to segue just a little bit in terms of education, we've been talking a lot about the very academic part of it, right? So math, English, the skills you need to be able to get that job. But education is about so much more than that. It's about civic mindedness, building certain values and ethics in our community, teaching children how to be human, and ultimately building a better society. So another reason as to why when people are left out of education, essentially we're setting ourselves up for, to me, in my opinion, a bit of a disaster. I'd like to get your opinions on this, Dr. Elizabeth.
Yep, I totally agree with you, Deborah. It's so important for the students to come together, to network. And we all know that the networks that we build in school are the networks that are going to take us further in life, eventually in careers. So very often we hear that, you know, so-and-so, their classmate, you know, made a connection for them for a job or for a business deal, etc. So that's what being inclusive is all about. The faster you bring them into that, the whole environment, and you socialize them within the system, it would be much, much better for them. Online education, it's quite interesting. You said 50-50, right? But it's true, because everyone is struggling with online education. Well, we talked about connectivity. We also talk about our adeptness, you know, how good are we in it? Not all of us, the young people are, mostly. Not all of us, especially the teachers, are so good at handling a computer, for example, and how to make themselves sound interesting, how to make the lessons look great, you know, and attractive to capture the students' attention, etc. So I can imagine that 50-50, you know, I'm not quite enjoying this kind of thing. And the teachers are also not really quite enjoying this. Why can't I have my students come back? But on the other hand, I'm beginning to hear that it's bringing some of the other more, I wouldn't say introverted students, but students who may not have spoken out so much in class, or may not even have been very interested in class, seemingly so. And these are the ones that I have been told are really coming out of their shells, because it's online. They are speaking much more, they're asking more questions, and they're communicating more. So I'm beginning to hear more and more of that kind of experiences from the educators themselves. So that is a good thing.
Okay, and jumping to you, Nick, just going back to the idea of certification, there was a question asked about schools. There's many little refugee schools in Malaysia, and they don't have accredited programs. How important is that in the global scale? And also, perhaps would you have some examples of countries or anyone doing it better?
Yeah, so I think it is a really important issue. And I think, unfortunately, it's a really challenging one also, because so much of it depends upon, again, a variety of stakeholders kind of agreeing to recognize a specific credential or a specific offering. And so, you know, while that can be challenging, it's incredibly important to the learner, because to go down a pathway of investing time and energy into a specific either degree program or certificate that perhaps is not recognized in a local country is extremely challenging and disappointing. I think what we're seeing kind of on a global scale is a lot more recognition in areas that kind of have been forced into online learning in kind of a more expedient fashion than they anticipated. And so we're seeing some countries in the Middle East that would have never come to the table before to have discussions about recognition or accreditation of online learning that are now kind of encouraging others to come to the table with them. And so in East Africa, we're seeing a lot of the same thing, where universities, whether it's US based and sub-Saharan African, are working together, being able to accredit one another's courses. That we're really able to that type of opening up of dialogue in and of itself, I think, really creates so much more opportunity for partnerships and ultimately pathways for learners themselves.
And Dr. Elizabeth, there's been a lot of questions coming in. I'll sort of try and summarize all of them just because we have a few minutes left.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of university students asking about what more universities can do, because they obviously have, you know, huge resources at their disposal to sort of help connect the dots, so to speak, right? So whether it's using facilities or, like you said, your internet connectivity or online learning resources that you can share perhaps with a remote school. So that's one. And secondly, advice to university students on what they can do personally to change, the lives of those more marginalized?
One of our biggest student groups on campus, in both the university and the college here in Bandar Sunway, is the Sunway Student Volunteer Society. And I think they could very much be the group that you worked with, Deborah, who has been helping out in your school. I love them. I mean, they have that spirit of volunteerism where they have taken upon themselves the very values that we want to instill in them, to offer themselves to help make that world, that better world that everyone dreams about, because we believe that it really starts from the self. It's not about what can you give me, but what can I give you, and what can I contribute and help in a situation. So so that is a kind of intrinsic thing that we do, and it permeates through the whole culture and ethos of Sunway. Very much from the fact that we are part of the Jeffrey Cheah Foundation, and the founder's own vision and legacy that he wants to leave behind. But having said all that, yes, facilities is one of the things to share it. For example, we opened up our library so that it's, while we could say that, look, our students need a space, and we have actually thought about this, but we said, look, but our students don't use it all the time. Are there certain times where we can open it up and allow for other people to come in? The founder has always envisioned our campus to be a lot more open. Obviously now we can't because of the pandemic, but to be a lot more open, to be a lot more embracing for the community, and the community at large is inclusive of literally everyone. So coming back to this, what can the students do? Volunteer yourselves. Join a group. Talk to us. I'm sure my student volunteers will be very happy to have you join them. It really doesn't matter whether you're a Sunway student or not, because we love working with the students from perhaps, even Taylor's, Monash. But aside from that, INTI, University of Malaya, people out there. I mean, the whole idea is to network, to collaborate, and that falls in very well with what we do. But the young people, especially now, are the ones that we need to empower. Yeah, that word would be empower, because to instill in them that the power is within their hands to really change the world, and really change the lives of, in this particular case, the marginalized community. Don't just talk. You put your action in place and see what we can do about it. And I suppose our role will be to see how we can help facilitate this and to support it more.
Thank you. We just have a couple minutes left, and I just want to jump to you very quickly, Nick. I don't want to get into policy and framework and national education policies and all that sort of fun stuff. I think the focus here is that's perhaps the long roadmap ahead in terms of change, but really in individuals. Do you have any final thoughts on just for the viewers, how recognizing the limitations we can chart our way forward?
Yeah, I think starting small. Starting with a humble beginning with a program or a community, find a like-minded partner who has compatible vision and compatible empathy, I suppose, and start with one small thing. So that our initiative started with very small pilot programs in small communities, and that gave us the opportunity to learn as much as possible, because that's kind of the key to our continued evolution. And I think that of most organizations is start small, learn as much as you can, listen to the voices of the beneficiaries and partners, and then adapt your vision accordingly, or adapt your strategy accordingly. So that would be one piece of advice I know with the limited time we have left, is start small and learn from it.
And I have to say that's what we're doing, right? We've been Fuji organization has struck up a conversation with Nick all the way in Arizona. Couldn't be any further away from us, distance and time difference. And we're trying to see what we can do together to create higher learning education opportunities for displaced people all over the world. And I think we share the same challenges anyway. So why do it alone, right?
Exactly.
And finally, Sabri, there was a question from a viewer. She, I think, asked, what is your dream? You mentioned that you want to study political science. Why? And what do you hope to achieve? And what stands in your way?
Well, that's a very great question. So most of the internship that I'm doing now and based on my experience, it's more about business administration. But why I chose political science is that I want to go back home and see what are actually the problems that are causing people to be refugees and that they flee the country, right? I have a whole map in my room now, that I did really kind of finding out the problems in different ways and all of that. So now I understand internally what's the problem that's going in my country and how the problem can be potentially solved. It's a very complicated problem that's going back in Yemen, but there is still possibility in actually, coming up with a peace plan between parties, and that Yemen will, rebuild again, and everything will be, just as developed countries.
Thank you, Sabri. So, guys, I think that's all the time we have. I'd just like to wrap up. I've always really believed, especially given limitations and challenges, that the private sector has a huge role it can play in really changing outcomes for individuals in this country and around the world. And I think today presents a great opportunity for us to really rethink what education is, moving away from the traditional sense of it to thinking out of the box, thinking about education not as a linear journey, but something that's different for everyone. And the fact that we all have a role to play as individuals, as teachers, as companies, even as a government. There was a question from a government civil servant who asked, what can I do? And that's even, it could start with just changing how people think about a refugee, a stateless individual, just within your own office. That in itself could have a huge, long-lasting change for society and for people's lives. And I love what Nick said about creative partnerships, tap into the global market, see what other people are doing, work together. And I think it's a global issue and we need today to solve it in a global way. And finally, I'd like to end with one of my favorite quotes by the great Nelson Mandela. He said, education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world. Change is happening for better or for worse. And that's where you have an opportunity to ask yourself the right questions, to make change happen today, now, in your lives. And think about justice for all. Think about the life you would like to live. And that's exactly the life somebody else would like to have the opportunity to live too. So thank you so much to my panelists for joining us, Nick, Sabri, and Dr. Elizabeth, and to Sam, who unfortunately couldn't be with us today. We'd love to speak to you sometime soon. And thank you to all of our viewers for tuning in. And we hope you've got some insight into this kind of complex topic. But like Dr. Elizabeth said, we're making headway, stepping stones. But I think that's where change comes, right? Not stopping. And I'm very inspired and hopeful because I think that the future is the youth and they are changing. And I see it firsthand. So I've got hope for a better tomorrow for refugees, stateless, Orang Asli, the B40 community in Malaysia, that opportunities and access for them will improve day by day. Thank you so much for tuning in, and thank you to our panelists. Yes, we'll see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you.